hello, hello. You're from Germany. My name is Sven Fössing, and I'm hosting today the panel and workshop with Chris Hülsbeck, who is right now in Arizona in a desert and has a far more better internet connection like someone us here in Germany in some of the biggest cities. So welcome, Chris.
Hello, hello. Yes, let's hope the internet connection stays well. But right now it's working. I see you well, and yeah, welcome everyone. I don't even know who's watching. How many people are there?
I have also no
We're
clue.
not. We're getting no stats.
Well, right now we get no stats, but I get a message back. Okay, works. Thanks. So yes, we are really live now. And whoops. So yes, no, it's better because I also posted it on on social media that we are live now. And yes, Chris, in the next 2 hours, we go back in time as first because as you see behind us now, if you watch this, you see some old computer graphics because this is the start where it all begins with Chris Hülsbeck. But before we start with the workshop, I made some other interviews here for the B3, and I started with 3 questions for everyone. So, okay, the first is after my short introduction, maybe you make a more detailed introduction, who you are and what are you doing, because maybe someone is watching us who has no idea. And also, what was your first computer and your first video game or that most memorable video game from that time on the 80s?
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
So the introduction. So my name is Chris Hülsbeck. I'm a video game composer for like almost 35 years. So I started really early, and we're going to go into details actually in that
Yes.
first hour where we show my history and play some music that happened along the way. And yeah, basically that's it. The question about my first computer was the Commodore 64, of course.
Okay.
And we're going into details there too, why and how and all that stuff. And the first game, now that was actually the Atari video game console, or if you will, before I started playing on arcade machines, early arcade machines. So like, you know, I don't know. The old arcade games. Some of them were even monochrome. I remember.
Okay. So and now I think we go because we have you made a presentation which makes it very easy for me. But we switch now to the presentation.
By the way, we
Yes.
did not talk about how I can actually see what you're calling up the
Oh,
slide.
yeah. Maybe you open the stream.
Okay, do I have a link for that?
Or I try. What I can try is, if that's possible, I can try a screen share in our.
That would probably be helpful. See, I didn't even think about that. I sent you that, and the presentation, those slides, they're pretty basic, but they give us good talking points, few photos, and some sound music examples. Yeah, now I see it. Perfect.
This is perfect. Modern Technic, it works fine. So, I make it now full screen, and then so it's also for me. And
nice.
also, I can switch it because then everyone in the screen. You see the screen is a little bit dirty from the monitor. Sorry for that. I haven't cleaned it up right now. So
Are you filming it off the monitor?
I filming it off the monitor. Yes. So no. So we start with Christopher Friedrich Martin Hülsbeck. Okay, you have three first names. I have only
Right.
two. I've only Sven Oliver.
Yep.
Born.
And when I actually grew up and I went to school, the name, I mean, Christoph was pretty common
Yep.
in Germany, but Christopher was not that common. So I was actually, I liked Martin better. And
Okay.
at one point, I think when I was 10 years old, I wanted to change my first name to Martin. But, well, nowadays, good thing I didn't, because in the US, Christopher is actually a very common name. And yeah, so it works much better now.
It works much better. And was it also when you did something wrong, your parents called you Christopher Friedrich Martin, like me as Sven Oliver?
That might have happened. Yeah, I don't know. But anyway, so yeah, I was born in Kassel, Hessen, and but I grew up near Frankfurt, in a small town called Langen.
Oh,
That's
I
where I
know
went to
it.
school, and that's where I spent most of my youth. And
Wow.
yeah, so I was born in a very musical family. My grandma was a pretty well-known piano teacher in the area.
Mm.
And so I actually had piano lessons from age 5 to about 7. But I wasn't really into playing. First of all, I wasn't much into playing other people's music. And
Okay.
secondly, my grandma was, even though she was generally a nice person, but when it came to like teaching, she was very old school.
Ooh,
And
okay.
she would hit her students with a stick if we made mistakes. So that wasn't quite for me. So I dropped that at age 7. And then here's a photo from when I got into school, and then let's move on. And then I had my first encounter on the radio with a sound that was totally different from all the classical music and the piano and everything that I used to hear at home. And that was the synthesizer. And really the first piece that I remembered was that popcorn piece.
Yes, yeah.
And that fascinated me. I must have been like 6, 7 years old. And then a few years later, I discovered a radio show from actually Frankfurt that was called Sounds from Synthesizer. And I listened to that every week. And so I got exposed to like all the big names in electronic music, like Kraftwerk and Jean-Michel Jarre and Vangelis and all those big names, Tangerine Dream. And really my heart was set on, I wanted to make synthesizer music, right? But my family couldn't afford the expensive machinery. So if you go to the next slide, something like this I dreamt about, but I couldn't afford it, or we couldn't afford it. But my mom, she actually had an electric organ, and that's where we go next. That actually ended up in my room eventually, and so I was recording my first music piece, and I still have all my music that I ever did recorded. I recorded it back then on tape, and then eventually transferred them on DAT and then the computer, and I still have them. So the next slide is my first piece that I ever composed and recorded.
So please listen.
On the organ, yeah. Of course, I can't hear it.
I mean, that is really fascinating that you still have all this music that you created and also your first composition. So that was created in Langen. It's very fascinating because I lived 2 years in Egelsbach. So, but
Yeah.
with a time difference about I think 20 years. So yeah, that's really fascinating that you still have all this.
In fact, that's like one of the topics for the second hour where we talk about,
Yes.
like how to create game music and stuff like that. It's like backups. I cannot emphasize this enough because you don't want to lose any work that you did ever. And there's ways to try to deal with that. But in any case, then I was obviously not quite that pleased with the sound of it because I was still aspiring to Tangerine Dream and all those things. So I started circuit bending the organ. So the next slide is I made new contacts in the organ, and I put like switches on it and potentiometers and stuff like that, sliders, whatever, and wired them up into different parts of the organ and try to improve the sound. And
okay, how react your parents when you said, okay, I will now build circuit boards and will this and this, didn't they say no, this is not this is too
well, actually, they kind of let me do what I wanted to do because I was kind of like the mad little professor there in the house, and my room was my lab, and I don't know the countless things that are taken apart in the electronics and things, and I'm surprised, I didn't get like poisoned by all that stuff because there was some crazy things that I did. But anyway, so and this was even before circuit bending was even a thing, or like nowadays people do that all the time, but back then I just did it because I felt like, oh, I can improve this thing. And so the next piece that we're hearing is actually the modified organ that particularly in the end you already hear like kind of like a filter sweep and sounds much more like a synth.
So this is really strange because
it's not playing.
No, it's playing. Yeah, it's totally different. As for me, for my ears, it sounds like a complete different unit.
But there's more to the story. So I kept after I recorded that, I kept, of course, trying out new things, and eventually the organ exploded. I did it a little bit too much eventually, and the thing crapped out, and that was that for that organ. Very sad ending, yeah. But I kept going, and so let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so I read in a magazine that about, I got interested in computers, and I still was playing video games with that Atari console, but I wanted like a computer so I could program and stuff. And then I saw a magazine ad about the Commodore 64, and in small letters somewhere it was printed that it had a real synthesizer sound chip. And then I read everything about it, that it actually had like typical synthesizer waveforms and even a filter and stuff. And I knew, that could be the machine where I could have my synthesizer sound for a reasonable price. And I saved up money. I was, delivering newspapers and things like that. And eventually I was able to get my Commodore 64. And then when I got it, I was turning it on and nothing happened. I mean, it's not like computers nowadays where you have like a ton of programs to choose from and applications that you can use to make music. There was nothing. I mean, you should switch that thing on and you're just sitting in front of a command line screen. And so I had to start learning programming. But I was also, of course, like the first 2 years, I was totally like playing games. And then I did some experiments with music, but BASIC was just too slow. And I also wanted to become a game programmer, by the way. So I was like interested in designing my own games. And so BASIC was not cutting it. So I had to actually learn assembly language, the actual CPU instructions, and that runs so much faster. I remember like the first time I got something done where like filling the screen was like characters. That would usually take in BASIC like a good half a second, and you could actually see it like printing the characters. And then I did the same in machine language and in assembly. And when I executed the program, I couldn't believe it. It was just there. You couldn't even see it like being printed. And that was really a revelation. You know, I felt very good about that. And then I started to program. And but it turned out games was not that, I wasn't that good of a games designer and programmer. But a friend of mine was actually pretty good at it, and he had already sold a game to a company, and he was working on a second game, but he wasn't good with sound and music. So
What
I
was the name
composed my
of your friend?
Planet of War, and his name was Arthur Wistup.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's the first piece on the Commodore 64 that I ever composed, and that actually ended up in a game. And so we can listen to that now.
Yeah. Awesome. It's awesome.
Yeah, pretty basic, but my friend was super happy about it. He sold the game, but it actually came out a year later, and by then I actually had already improved my music player, and I was part of a contest in a magazine. The C64 magazine in Germany was pretty big, and they held a contest about writing music for this Commodore 64. I sent my piece in, and that Shades, and it, to my surprise, won the first place in that competition. And you can already hear the leap, and this was only a few months apart between the Planet of War song and the Shades.
Yeah.
How much my programming and the music improved.
Yeah. That's really different. Wasn't it so that you did something? I think that was also the reason, one of the reasons you won the first prize with your tool. That everyone said before that it's not possible to do, because with the available, I think, channels.
Yeah, that's a little bit later. I mean, the new thing about Shades for me was that it included these fast note changes, arpeggios, which could kind of simulate chords, which would greatly enhance the music experience. And I didn't invent that. That was actually, I heard that first from a piece from Martin Galway.
Okay, yeah.
But I had the same basic idea. If I like change the notes really quick, maybe it would resemble something like a chord.
Yep.
And then when I heard Martin Galway's music, I knew, okay, that I have to include something like that on my player. But also, the Shades player had a lot of other cool stuff. With like vibrato, which makes the lead sounds more sweet, and filters and all kinds of stuff that I put in there. But it was really hard to program because I still was making the music with just hexadecimal numbers. Input into memory was a so-called monitor program, and so all the music really had to be totally in my head. I couldn't even see the note names. I had to like translate, this I don't know, number 46 is a C, middle C or something, and then so on. And that was very tedious. So I conceived right away after I won that contest a tool that could make that music entry easier, and that was the sound monitor. And this was actually then featured a few months later in the sister magazine Happy Computer as a listing of the months. And if you look at it, this looks very similar to like modern trackers. And so a lot of people say that this was basically like the grandfather of trackers. And there's a few differences, but it's the general layout with the 3 tracks, and then you can input notes more as like note names where you write it out, like a E in the second octave or something, and with that, then I got it, or I called up game companies in Germany and asked if they have any work for me. And one of them was Rainbow Arts, and they offered me an in-house gig right away. And that's when I moved. I left school and I moved to Gütersloh and spent my nights there developing new technologies. And one of them was I wanted to enhance the channels, which you mentioned, of the Commodore 64. So I came up with playing digital sounds alongside the SID channels. And so I could like, a friend of mine built a little, sample recorder and hardware, a sampler. And so we recorded all kinds of like drum sounds and voices and things like that. And that became one of the Rainbow Arts games. I have an example for that. Yeah. Ding, 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 ding.
So, but this is also the I think one of the main difference, because as you said before, you have to hear the music first in your head, because you have to. It was not a composing, but it was also more a programming back in this time to create music.
Absolutely. This is also a thing. When I started out, there were maybe a handful of people in Europe that were doing this. And it was much more the job of a programmer instead of a composer, which has totally turned nowadays. You definitely compete with a lot of great, talented composers out there, and they have probably not much idea of the underlying programming that is going into it. I mean, there's still scripting and stuff for games, but it's definitely so much easier, and the music itself is produced in the studio nowadays, even with orchestras. We're gonna touch on that later, but so with that I moved on to another system called the TFMX. The reason was I actually went, after I'd done a few games with that sample technology, that games were advancing and they just didn't have the CPU to do the sample mixing. And the C64 got another revision that wouldn't play samples as well. So we moved away from that, and that's why I created TFMX, which was a new concept based on the sound monitor, but with the difference that for every note that is played, a little script would be initiated. and that script could have then like program flow commands like wait and continues and stuff like that, but it could also change all the registers on the SID chip. And with that, I was able to do much more complex drum sounds with a normal SID channel, and also multiplex the channels so that they sounded like 4 or 5 voices, even though it was only the original 3 SID channels. And one piece for that is my title track for R-Type on the C64, and that's the next one.
Yeah.
That's actually always like high in the charts when people talk about C64 music. So it's also one of the last projects that I did on the C64, because I was already moving on to the Amiga computer. Yeah, at that time it was I think pretty state of the art in terms of the sound that you could get out of the SID chip.
Yep.
And then the next step is moved on to the Amiga, and did basically the same concept of TFMX on the Amiga, and right away implemented that sound macro system where you have like a little script that plays when and with that I was able to get immediately sounds out of the Amiga that other people wouldn't be able to get. For example, the Amiga hardware could not play samples backwards, but with my sound macros, I had a thing where I was looping a really small slice of a sample, and then I was moving the start point from the end of the sample to the beginning slowly, and it would sound like if something would play backwards. And one good example is and I have to talk about that, the R-Type title on the Amiga is different from the C64, because I felt when I moved on to the Amiga that just recreating that same composition would not do justice to the Amiga sound chip. So I figured, why not give it a totally different composition that's more, I wanted it to sound more cinematic, because the Amiga is sample based, and you could sample in like kind of like strings and brass instruments and stuff like that. So I'm gonna listen to that now.
I mean, really, I remember the track, and but it's really fascinating to listen right now to you to explain how hard it was to compose this, and also, as you said, that it usually was not possible, but sometimes it's really fascinating when you hear that. In one of my other interviews was the Hungarian developers. They developed games for the C64, which they sold to UK and Epics, and they released them. And they got the C64 and had no idea, and did something with the computer, with effects, 3D effects, like Scarabeus, where everyone said before that is not possible, because they did it because they didn't know it wasn't possible, so they just did it. So that's very fascinating to hear that.
Yeah, C64 and Amiga was really an incredible time of like exploration and pushing the envelope on the hardware possibilities, and it was really exciting. One thing about this R-Type piece was, I mean, that like made really waves inside of Rainbow Arts. The morning I had that finished, I played it for my producer there, and he called in other people to listen to this because they couldn't believe what they were hearing, and so it was really cool. And then I moved on. I worked with Factor 5 on the Turrican franchise, and particularly Turrican II was, I think, the best known project of my career there. And for that, I pushed the envelope again because there was actually an Atari ST programmer, musician who was really a good programmer, much better than I was even in assembly coding, and he made a simulation of the Amiga sound chip for the Atari ST because the ST could not play more than one sample channel. So he made like a CPU mixer. And I had experimented with enhancing the capabilities of the Amiga, but I wasn't getting very far and the quality was really bad by mixing two channels by the CPU into each of the Amiga 4 channels. So that would make then 8 voices, but they would all sound crappy and it was a lot of CPU. So eventually when I saw Jochen Hippel's player on the Atari ST, I asked him, hey, would you like, or could you share me the innards of your source code there, and I would port it over to the Amiga and output it on one of the Amiga channels, and then keep 3 of the regular Amiga channels normal, like normal sounding.
Yep.
So that's how the 7-voice system was born, and it I think that got really like good feedback, and because then you could decide like a sound that didn't need that high fidelity could be played on the 4 CPU voices, but then a sound like a bell or something with like high frequency content that would sound not that good on a CPU mix channel could be played on one of the other 3 Amiga channels. And that was definitely another milestone. So let's go forward.
Yeah,
one more. Yeah.
I mean, this is your most, I think, the most famous or well-known known track, or, I mean, I think.
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah.
Yeah, this is awesome.
And thank you. And then after that, I founded my own games company with 2 friends, and we worked on different things, including building a recording studio in our offices. And I had since I joined Rainbow Arts a few years earlier, I had the dream of like creating an album, like a record, vinyl, or a CD at the time. And that never happened. But then when we founded our own company, we wanted to make that a reality. And in fact, so in 91, I put out my first CD. Has a lot of game music on there, but also a few pieces that are not games related. And it was very well received by the fans.
Yes,
and
I know. I was one of those.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I think I've met you first at one of the Amiga conventions in Cologne.
Right.
But then I was, and smaller.
Yeah. And so that was definitely a dream come true for me. I also had like a pretty sizable studio at the time, and certainly a few synthesizers that I liked. And
now you could afford them.
And then I worked on a game called Apedia, which is also highly ranked in Amiga fan circles. and did put a CD out for that, and then more CDs followed. So that's the next slide.
A lot of CDs followed. Right now, because I've moved and I have everything in boxes, I don't. I think I have the To Be on Top soundtrack. I don't know Shades, but I remember I had the CD, but yeah, I moved at different times, so
Yeah. You can find pretty much all my albums on all the music services, you know, like Spotify, and
yep.
particularly I like Bandcamp. That's my own indie shop that I have
Yep.
there. They have what's nice about Bandcamp is that they allow downloads in WAV and FLAC,
Yep.
additionally to other formats. Which is the best quality. So it's always the CD masters that I put in there. And in case where albums had booklets like these, all these first albums, I scanned them all in, and they are also attached as
Cool.
PDF files, which is nice. Yeah. So okay, and then I moved to the US, and in the late '90s, game development had kind of like come to a screeching halt in Germany. They were mostly doing like multimedia projects and advertisement games, and that wasn't quite my thing. So then I got the chance to follow Factor 5 to the US. They had moved 2 years earlier, and they were working on a Star Wars game. And they needed my expertise there because that was one of the last games or consoles, the Nintendo 64, that had a cartridge instead of like the typical CD that the PlayStation had or later systems, where on the CD systems you could afford to play music that was produced in a studio.
Yeah.
But on the N64, it had to be made just like in the old days with the C64 and Amiga. It had to be programmed. And we took the same concept that I started with TFMX and ported it to a platform independent system, which was called Musix. And that was developed in-house at Factor 5. And it used the same sound macro system that I had. And it could play, usually during the game, about 16 to 20 voices. And in the so-called front-end title parts and things, it could play, I think, easily 32 or more channels. But it was still a major challenge to make like a Star Wars soundtrack with essentially MIDI music and samples.
But how was it also? I mean, as you said, you also play games and you also are a fan. And how was it for you personally to create a soundtrack for a franchise like Star Wars or Indiana Jones?
I was honored and terrified at the same time. I mean, John Williams is really one, if not the my idol film composer. You know, I mean, there's a lot of great composers out there. I'm also a big fan of Alain Silvestri and Jerry Goldsmith, Hans Zimmer, all those big names. But John Williams definitely has a special place in my heart, because I actually, during the time I was really listening to a lot of synthesizer music, I also listened to my first film soundtracks, and they were from John Williams. Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and particularly E.T. I actually bought the record and listened to that up and down. And so that I became, you know, my first and number one film composer. And so yeah, I was definitely like in that mode. I'm not worthy, but I did the best I could. And in fact, after we decided to also compose new music for the game. So most Star Wars games at the time, they were just rehashing the soundtrack, and we had a few pieces from the soundtrack in there transcribed to MIDI with my samples, and a lot of work to make them sound anywhere near a real orchestra. And then I also had like about 50% of the game were new compositions, and that was the hardest part. And I actually I developed like a carpal tunnel doing that work in that year. I wasn't happy, and I couldn't even listen to it for years after that. And then when I finally, after a few years, listened back to it, I thought like, oh, actually, I did a pretty decent job
Yeah.
there. But I like many creative types, definitely have a good portion of imposter syndrome, and sometimes don't think as highly of my work as other people might. So yeah, but I did it, and we continued. We did three more follow-ups actually to
Yeah.
this, and then moved on to
Oh,
another milestone in 2008. A fan and friend of mine, Thomas Böker, he had put on a few video game concerts over the years
yeah.
with one or two pieces of mine in there during the games convention in Leipzig. And he got a deal with the WDR, the Cologne radio station,
Yeah. Yeah.
that had their own orchestra to play a full concert with video game music. And he, because he was such a fan of my work, decided to put on a whole show just with my music, and that was absolutely mind-boggling. Um, uh, I was sitting in that audience listening to the music, and we had like amazing arrangers. So I couldn't have done all that work myself, arranging and orchestrating. So we actually had some really cool people doing that work. Jonneval Tonen is one of them, who I think went. He was an early like scene music guy.
Yeah.
I think his scene name is Purple Motion.
Oh.
And then he studied music at a conservatory. Something that I'm totally self-taught, and I studied a lot of books about orchestration, but he really learned it at a scoring school, and he did an absolute fantastic job. And then we had a couple of guest arrangers like Yuzo Koshiro, for example, one of my game music idols from Japan, did one piece, and others. And I was sitting in the audience there, and tears were running down my cheeks, because this was such a once in a lifetime experience, really. And we're going to listen to one snippet here, also again from R-Type. So this is the R-Type Amiga compositions, but with a 100-piece live orchestra.
Yeah, I mean, I also get goosebumps when listen to this. But I think that's nothing what you have felt when you first time. I mean, around 22 years earlier you started, and I think you never could imagine that something like this will happen.
Never. And very emotional. And I mean, despite my grandma being a little bit of an old school teacher there, she would have loved to see me, but she had actually passed a few years before. So, but yeah, it was definitely a very emotional evening. And then after that, right after that, in the fall, Factor 5 US actually went out of business. That was, remember, like the financial downturn. 2008 was also definitely affecting a lot of game developers, and it wasn't our fault. It was really like the publishers that were essentially funding our projects that were in development that ran out of money, and so the company folded. Became freelance again, and I worked on a whole bunch of games which were really fun, like, for example, this Zombie Smash on iPhone. iPhone games were becoming a big thing,
Yeah.
and this was actually a hit game that you know, sold 1.5 million copies or something like that, and it was really fun to do. And then a bunch of other ones. Did actually some even some live orchestra recordings with my friends from Sound of Games. I did a Star Trek franchise game. Oh yeah, and I forgot about that one. Yeah, I forgot about that slide. So I did get a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Game Audio Network Guild in 2010. And the interesting part is that my acceptance speech, I was like making the joke, isn't this something that usually people get at the end of their career? So, you know, and everybody was laughing. So I hope, you know, that I might get a second award in 20 years from now or something. I don't know. In any case, that was also an honor to receive that award. And I think it's the reason they gave that to me is really because of my early years and that innovation that I did with the Commodore 64 Amiga and then on the other systems. And so, yeah, and then I did a bunch of more games. One of them didn't come out, unfortunately. The next
Star
one
Trek.
is the
yeah.
But the recordings actually live on, not under the Star Trek name, but I actually released the album with the blessing of the developer. So it didn't like end up in somebody's drawer somewhere. I was actually able to release it, and that's called Infinite Space Resurrection Soundtrack. So, and then War of the Worlds was another project. So now, even though that Star Trek game was never released, you know, I can say I worked on 4 or 5 of the major science fiction franchises.
Yeah, that's not bad.
So
I mean,
that actually was fun. And yeah, I also did like I did work for Doctor Who for another mobile game.
Mobile game, yeah, that was all a big success.
Yeah, it was a big success. A pretty little puzzle game, but it had actually a really cool soundtrack.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I haven't gotten the permission from them and the BBC to release that soundtrack yet. Maybe I'll try again in a few years. So, and then in 2012, I did a Kickstarter to bring back the Turrican soundtrack. It had been, well, almost 20 years since the first Turrican soundtrack. And that was like a 1 CD affair. And since we had like 5 games on various platforms, we figured, okay, that this needs like a proper release with studio recordings and other things. But I couldn't finance that myself. So that's when I saw like Kickstarter as one of the emerging platforms for crowdfunding. So I thought, well, let's give it a try. And in fact, became the most successful game music related Kickstarter at that time. And it became like a really big project. You know, it made its first goal in the first few days, and then from then it went up, and we decided to do all kinds of cool stuff, not just CDs, but also like a vinyl maxi single, and got like some guest composers and USB stick with engraving that had all the original music recorded from the Amiga and the consoles, and also a music box, which was one of the high-end items that you could get. It was a mechanical music box. Only 20 of them were produced, and so I had to actually learn to make music for a music box, and I worked with this company in New Mexico that had really good experience with it. But actually, they took my MIDI file and I didn't like the first arrangement. So then I went in and they said, oh, you know, you don't understand, you cannot do it that way. And I said, watch me. And because there's limitations on how many notes you can play in succession and stuff like that. And I brought down, I think, the number of notes from 150 or something down to 50 notes, and then it worked. But the composition was intact, and they were quite amazed with that, and it turned out really cool. So yeah, and then went on, did another Kickstarter,
The piano collection.
the
Yeah.
piano
Yeah.
collection, which yeah, was also well received, and we can actually play one piece from that.
Yeah.
That's again R-Type.
R-Type.
I always come back to R-Type.
Yes.
It's actually a fun thing. And I couldn't play it like that. So we actually had a friend of ours, Patrick Navian,
Yeah, sure.
do the performance, who is like also a huge Amiga fan. He actually still does stuff on the Amiga to this day. And he's like really a very talented pianist and keyboarder. And then we also, instead of just putting out a CD for that, we actually decided to put out the score sheets for it in two versions, beginner and the advanced version, how Patrick played it. And that was done with the help from Michael Stöckermann from Sound of Games, who translated the scores to sheet music. And yeah, also very cool project.
It was. I mean, this is still something hard to imagine when you look back. This game for the Commodore 64, and this is also awesome because then we heard the different the orchestration, the piano version, the original version, and I mean, it's still hard to imagine that this piece of music still move on, and that now it's a classic piece, it's a classic art piece.
Right. What I haven't here as an example is I also did an R-Type rendition of the title music for the iPhone and Android, and again a slightly different composition, just because I thought like, oh, this is like, it was 2011 or so where I did that, and I wanted to create something new for it. But yeah, the first hour is running out, so let's just move on. And I did a lot of like other little projects in between, but the big one here is again with my friend Thomas Böker, Turrican II, the orchestral album, another milestone where we did a Kickstarter to actually hire an orchestra to do a full album with live orchestra music. And again, we did it the following year again was another follow-up, Turrican Orchestral Selections. That's the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
And absolute mind-boggling arrangements that came out of this. Yeah, the albums are on Bandcamp everywhere, and check it out if you get a chance. And then currently I'm working on indie game Tiny Thor, which is supposed to come out sometime this year or early next year. And pretty cool little project because it has that that cool pixelated style from the gameplay from the old time, but with some enhancements, of course, that you can do nowadays. And it's just such a fun thing, this kind of retro style.
Fantastic. Okay, this is so it's still just possible to, I mean, this is, as you said, it's a smaller indie game. So if you have an idea for a game, and sure you have a bit of financial background, they can just ask you and say, here, that's my project, are you interested?
Mm-hmm.
So that's, and then you find a way. I remember one podcast when you said the Zombie Smash, and they ask you if you want a complete payment or a revenue share, and you said because you don't know the company, you said, okay, I want the payment. And at the end, the as you said, the game was a hit, and
Yeah, that was a little bit of a mistake. And on the second one, which was actually that R-Type on mobile platforms, I did ask for a share, and that was in the end one of the best financial deals that I've done.
Okay.
Because to this day it pays a few $100 every quarter. So
Okay. Wow.
yeah, so that's definitely something that I encourage when you work with a developer and they don't have a lot of budget. Definitely ask for a revenue share, even if it's a small thing. You never know what becomes like
Yep.
a hit. But you should also never work totally for free. So you
No.
should always get a little bit of payment up front, because again, you also don't want to have all the risk that it doesn't become a success and then
Yep.
you cannot pay your rent,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
But that's something for the second hour. I would
Yes.
say, by the way, can we also have questions from the audience in any way? Is there like
I
a chat
have
room?
no idea if there is a chat room. We have
Maybe
a
you
chat
can
of
ask about that.
it's a Vimeo, and
Mhm.
they send me a link for Vimeo, and they have no. So sadly, it's
Okay,
not like Twitch or something like this where you have a chat
right.
and can collect
But
questions.
you're gonna be then the fan who's asking all the
Yeah.
questions.
Yes.
Okay.
You know me.
So I would propose to take a little break, a few minutes, and maybe you can play something from my YouTube channel, because I have actually done another project kind of in my spare time, but it's also becoming more important now because I have a Patreon. For
Yeah.
people who don't know what that is a crowdfunding platform for small donations
Yeah.
or memberships or subscriptions, if you will, where people give like $1 or a few dollars or something a month. And I create a music piece each month. And I decided a few years ago to make all those royalty free, so people can use them in their own YouTube videos or games or whatever they can think of. And so this is like from a few months ago. This is called the Quantum Nights, and the idea was, and I always have like a little concept in mind for that month. So I wanted to create like kind of like an 80s TV show
Hmm.
intro. Think of all the Knight Riders and all those fun TV shows in the 80s. And this was kind of like science fiction with medieval elements, because like I thought, like, what if some knights from the Middle Ages
Yep.
were discovering time travel and they come into the future and fight crime in the 80s, that kind of thing.
Cool.
So yeah, let's listen to that, and then maybe after that go into my channel and play one of the other music videos that I
Yeah.
have,
Yeah.
and then we'll come back and do the second
Yeah.
hour.
I will put our video out right now and also play
Okay,
the music, but also you have to mute yourself
I
because
will.
yeah, okay, and when you are back then you said just hi, and then because we are still live in with this
Yeah,
audio. Okay,
I'll
so
also mute my camera then. Is
yeah,
that
you
okay?
can, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Until in a few minutes.
Okay, I'll be back. Bye. So then we go there and I play the So then I will go to his Bandcamp and maybe one or just YouTube moves on with some. So maybe to be on top. And if you have any questions, I have the Facebook chat right now open. I see, do you miss to work on a specific game track? I will ask it. So if you have still any questions at Facebook, just write it and I will ask him when Chris is back.
I'm back.
Okay, Chris is back because I'm also now at the Facebook page and we listened to be on top a bit. So I bring me back right now. Audio, you're also back right now. So there was one question right now on the Facebook stream. Do you miss to work on a specific game track?
Do I miss it? Well, since Turrican was such an important part in my past, we've been all dreaming about having another episode made on modern game systems, and so that's probably what I'm most interested on if I could pick up something. Yeah, working on Turrican again, and in fact, on that last orchestral album, the orchestral selections, there was a bonus album attached called Rise of the Machine, which is kind of like an imaginary Turrican soundtrack, and I actually created it just for fun. Oh my god, for fun, really. with my original Amiga sound tools and recorded it from an original Amiga hardware. So it's kind of like as if there had been another Turrican made for the Amiga in like 1994 or whatever.
So how was it to go back to work with the Amiga tools?
Very tedious. But I think from the composition standpoint, I really rose up to the challenge, and it was very well received. And many people think like, oh, that could have been in fact another soundtrack in the series. So that part was good, but it was a lot more work than I thought. And I actually, from today's point of view, I cannot even fathom how I worked with that tool in the past. And if I could go back, I would probably spend a lot of more time enhancing and improving the TFMX sound tool, because it was just not very friendly to use.
Okay. Yeah. So that was the history. But the second hour, we will talk about how it is to write music, to compose music for an actual game, and you will give us an overview how the work, how this works, and we will switch also to your presentation. And as I said before, if you got any questions at the Facebook page, I have the stream open, so you can ask. That is no problem. So I will switch now again. Yes, you see it, and going back to full screen. Yeah. And
so one thing I have to say though is I have not done this kind of talk before. So I just wrote down some bullet points, and I hope I can get give you an insight. But it's not comprehensive, of course. Yeah, so you go actually line by line. So you just press the space bar or whatever, and then it comes like
the bullet points come in. I have to refit it on the screen right now because it's a bit
too big.
Yeah, it's too big for the but we will fit it.
I see it perfect.
Yeah.
just so I'm not like a university professor doing this, but I should be able to give people a little bit of insight. So you got this game project, or you want to make a game, and you want to make the soundtrack for a game. What's the first question you should ask is, what's the right music for a game, or this game that you are working on, or whatever. And so let's go to the first bullet point and elaborate on that. Yeah, so essentially, like, it's music for games is like composing music for an image or moving images. So you can actually draw a lot from what you see in movies or in other games. And so I would like sit down and look at what's there and think about the mood, the emotions. What do you want the music to enhance for the experience? So it has to obviously fit the visuals. Okay, of course, some exceptions, but definitely you want to enhance the whole audio-visual experience. And so that's what you would do. You would sit down, check the mood, emotions, and see if there's other examples that you can draw from if you don't have an immediate idea of what you want to do.
Yeah.
And so I would look at other games, watch movies, and take it from there. Yeah, do not plagiarize, but use it as a starting point.
I was very fascinated when I because I right now I sell a lot of stuff from my collection because I've moved to another place and I have not so much storage left. And when I checked the box art, and sometimes you realized, okay, hey, this is International Karate Plus. I mean, this is Steven Seagal at the cover. I mean, it was not licensed, but so that there were some points, not like music, but they used person or recreate cover from movies. Was very fascinating to realize this today. At this time, I never checked it, but yeah, that's important. But that's the main difference, because to get an inspiration for music or to copy artwork. I mean, as hard as it is.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next, which is also like think about the instrumentation and the music styles, and that's an important part, because obviously you wouldn't like put techno trance music into a Western game. So
not really. It's
exactly, except, and I said like this exception of the rule, sometimes in a certain scenario you can go the opposite way just to give the player an experience you would usually not get, So this can be done very effectively, but you wouldn't score the whole game that way. But a good example is like in Turrican we had this underwater world, and instead of like having this driving action music, we decided to play like a dreamy waltz. And so that was like this kind of counterpoint that you can do, and that's also a kind of a fun thing of games, that you're not quite as rigid as let's say in movies, where there's like a certain expectations from the audience. So in that way you have a little bit more freedom.
Okay,
let's move on. Yeah, so ideally, if you are in the process and you already can see something of the game, or you have a written out concept, you can think of all the different situations in the game that need music, and also think about what those scenes or experiences for the player are in an emotional sense. Example, quiet, sad, exciting, fast-paced, thrilling, heroic. that all plays into how you would then approach your composition, or where you would draw inspiration from other composers that have done stuff like that. But basically, like, come up with a list, and usually those lists are getting very long, very quick in a game, particularly nowadays where games can take like hours or days to complete. You have to really think about, so big projects can explode in music assets too. Yeah, so of course, if you can already play a demo of the game, if the developer already has something like that, you can have a spotting session. You know, play the game, let the developer play it for you, and then think about where do you want to put music in. And maybe, I mean, if you're, you know, some people like examples. It's kind of like similar to temp tracks. You know, the developer might say, hey, this scene we're thinking about, like having music similar to what's done in that movie or something like that, and then you can either go with that, or you can come up with something new that is similar or even better. You know, you're the composer. You also have to have a little bit of a thick skin sometimes, and just work it out. You know, if you can come up with something better than what they have in mind, absolutely make a suggestion or send them a little demo or something like that. And you might be surprised. They might be very open to what you have to bring to the table.
Is there a main difference? Because when you worked as Rainbow Arts, Kaiko, Factor 5, you were the whole time at the company. But nowadays, I have the feeling that most of the composers, freelancers that were booked for different games, are not in the office right now, and
that has definitely changed majorly since the beginning.
Okay.
I mean, game composer was a full-time job in many companies for many years, and then I would say, like in the early 2000s or so, that shifted, where you had a lot of more out-of-house freelance composers, and they usually also, like in the early days there, they were hired pretty late in the process, which created time constraints and not the most ideal scenarios. I think nowadays game developers are better, where they think pretty early on who they want to work with, and get that process into a similar situation as if the freelancer would be in-house, so that they can see like early versions of the game and get a feel for it, and have more time developing it. But yeah, this has definitely shifted.
Okay. So
Yeah, this we touched on before.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's important to take chances and not do what is expected, and it can sometimes work out to the benefit of the project, the game, and so you have to also sometimes be bold and take risks.
Yeah. Oh.
Yep. So next thing that I thought like might be interesting is, how do you come up with a good melody? Because I mean, we're not just like machines who are writing some generic background music, like elevator music or whatever. You want to actually create something that sticks in people's minds, and the best the players, you know, and the best way to do that is come up with like good melodies. And so I was thinking about that. How do you do good melodies? And for me personally, it's actually a thing that probably started in my childhood when I was banging away on the piano, and I was, so let's come up with that first line there. So yeah, listen to a lot of music. That's what I did when I was a kid. Listen to a lot of that electronic music, pop music, classic, whatever. And if I heard something that I liked, I tried to recreate it just by ear.
Okay.
Um,
This is.
and this is actually not that difficult if you train it a little bit. You can figure it out. I mean,
Yep.
you just play it and then you find the notes, and that's a good skill to have. Some people are really extremely good at it, where they hear something once and they can play it immediately in the right key.
Yeah.
But that's, for me, it was also a lot of trial and error. But I
Yeah.
figured things out, and that, just like working with it, and nowadays you actually have a lot more possibilities. You can find MIDI files on the internet of a lot of film music and pop music, and you can load it into your sequencer and actually see the notes yourself. So analyzing how melodies work is a very important thing to write a good melody.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated of the fact that a lot of musicians and good musicians and famous musicians can't read notes and write notes, and they just have it in their head and then they play it and record it. So that's really fascinating.
Yeah. This is like one thing when I came up and I had a little bit of those piano lessons,
Yeah,
but I don't retain much. I
yeah,
mean, I cannot play from a sheet of piano music, but
yeah.
I can certainly make sense of it. If I see a score, I have an idea what the notes are and what they're doing, and I know the symbols, and I can follow a full score for an orchestra, and I see, okay, this is playing a
Yep.
staccato note or whatever, things like that. But I cannot play from a score, and I cannot just like with a pencil write
Yep.
it out. That is a skill that certainly helps a lot. But I think the general feel for the music is the more important part.
Mm-hmm.
The other stuff is more technical, and it certainly helps if you learn it nowadays. But it's not totally necessary to build a career. I think it's more about like uh, just living music, you know.
Okay.
I mean, a famous example is Hans Zimmer, who is, I think, similarly self-taught,
Yeah.
and he has a network of people around him who write it up for the orchestra and make it like work in a session. But he comes up with these incredible harmonies and melodies that are really like sticking in your head,
It's
and that's, I think, because he was just like living it
Yep.
from the day he was starting to become interested in music.
I really I really one of these concerts he made. He tell very, and this is something that sticks in my mind together, because when they released I think the Dark Knight Rises movie, there was this guy who committed Amoklauf, the
Yeah,
English.
yeah, the running amok. Yeah.
He running amok in a theater with the
Uh-huh.
premiere of the movie, and they had a premiere in England, in London, and and Hans they cancelled the premiere, and Hans Zimmer, he said, okay, he has to do something, and he said, words are not the thing that I can express something. So he wrote a music piece for the city, for Aurora, and it's called Aurora. It's really dramatic piece, and really you
Hmm.
feel the dramatic inside and the heart. So that's really fascinating how people express, as you said. So yeah.
Exactly, and I think this is also going back to like innovating. You
Yeah,
know, Hans Zimmer is an innovator
yeah,
in scoring, and he does not things like other classically trained composers do because he's thinking of it. If he wants a horn section with 20 horns, he just makes it happen, you
yeah,
know, because he knows that's something that nobody else has done before.
yeah,
And that's his skill. He knows he cannot compete with the John Williams on the composing and orchestration side, but he can innovate in other
mm,
ways, and that's, I think, an important part to find
yeah,
your own strengths and innovation.
yeah.
So let's go on to the next, which is basically goes back to what I said before.
Yes.
Figure out music by just sitting down and try to play the melodies, and also like try to play the bass notes or the chords together with it, because a melody by itself is hard to write that it's something that works. There's very few examples where that works. For example, the what was that? Axel F, the Eddie Murphy movie.
Yeah.
That theme works just by playing the notes of the melody by itself. But in a lot of times, a melody works together with a bass or chords. So that's something. But if you sit down and do that for a while, you actually see patterns of why things work and what doesn't work. So next line is going into that. I usually, when I just try to build a melody, I usually call up a piano sound, because it's one of the most versatile ones to figure out a melody. Of course, there are sometimes exceptions. If you want to write a very low melody with an orchestra, you might want to go to like a French horn, for example.
Yeah.
Makes a very good instrument for this slow moving, low, moody melody.
Yeah.
But most of the time, regular piano sound is a really good starting point. Yeah, I mean, again, like get inspired by the visuals of the game. So
do the developer, I mean, are there differences between developers that say, yeah, you get this is my game, you get the art piece later, or are they aware of that it is better to include you as much as possible?
nowadays, I think developers are much more keen to bring in people who are creating the art, and music is part of the art early on, because it might also influence how they are approaching things or where they're taking it. So usually it starts out with a design document where you map out what the game is doing. There's like a story in there. There's describing of what the player will experience. And bringing in a composer at that stage is definitely beneficial, even if they might not start working, doing the brunt work, maybe months or even a year or so later. It's good to have them on board early on, so that they can familiarize themselves and see the development progressing, and then get ideas and collect ideas. And then, of course, like there's with every game development, there's usually a major push at the end to get everything done. So most of it coming together in the last few months, and that includes the music, but it's good to have it early on if possible. Yeah, music theory, if you go to like conservatory and study music from the ground up, that can be definitely helpful, but applying too much music theory at the point of composing can also be a distraction, you know. So I would, for me personally, I would always approach it more from an emotional side. Playing around, playing the melody in different ways, change notes around, and just see. Sometimes there's even like what I call the happy accidents. They're just like when you play around, you make mistakes, but sometimes a mistake can also be a plus. You can take it in a different direction, and then all of a sudden it turns into something that you never thought about before. So don't get too hung up in like musical scales and what the next chord should be, because that's what the music theory is telling you. But try something different, and all of a sudden you're coming up with something innovative. And that goes also with the next line here, that you don't make mistakes. And then keep going. And this is like very important for this trial and error phase of things. So the next line talks about that.
Okay. Yeah.
Record everything.
Yes, yes.
Always. In fact, like I use Steinberg Cubase as a MIDI audio sequencer, and it has a function built in where it actually records everything all the time. And if you think like you played something 5 seconds ago that sounds really cool, but you don't want to start a fresh recording and lose that, you can actually do what's called a retroactive recording, where you just press a key command and it's saves what you actually played 5 seconds ago.
Okay.
Okay. In the past, I've just, played maybe some bass notes or something in a loop and then played over it, tried to different versions of the melody, and I had the recording on all the time, and it was recording in a big cycle. And then you had like a lot of stuff that you can then discard later, but at least it was there and I wouldn't lose it.
Yep.
And yeah, another important thing, don't make it complicated, keep it simple. You can do the complexity later by adding more instruments, more parts, and the arrangement, instrumentation, that kind of stuff. But the basic melody doesn't have to be overly complicated. And in a lot of cases nowadays, when I do it, I go with my gut, and usually like one of the first trials is usually the right one. So that's like an important lesson. Yeah, but then again, once you have your simple melody, you want to of course repeat it, but you also want to add minor variations to it, because that makes it then not boring. Because if you just like repeat a 5-second melody 10 times, then it's not going to work. Then you have to change it up, and but the basic melody is still simple, but then you go on to do the variations, and that's where you get something that is actually exciting. Right. The rhythm of a melody is just as important as the pitches themselves. So you can have a melody and just try to rearrange the notes in their timeline. There's in classical terms, it's like note lengths and rests, and you can play around with those and come up with better versions of a melody. And so that's definitely an important part. So if you have a melody, try to also not just improve the pitches, but also how they are in the timing, the rhythmic element of it. Yeah, and then in the end, I said like piano is good for finding melodies, but try different instruments with your melody. That can then bring on a whole new flavor, or maybe even within the arrangement, play the melody with different instruments. It's kind of like the question and answer thing. You have the melody play with one instrument that's maybe a lower register, and then you play it with a flute, and you get like this dialogue going. And then try to add layers. That's a very powerful tool also to for the arrangement. You can start the melody simple, just one note at a time, but then maybe add later a repetition that has another version of the melody, like a few notes up, like an interval or something, or even like an octave up or down with an interval. Those can work very well. And sometimes then you have to change some notes because they're not fitting into the overall chord structure, but that actually adds a nice flavor to something. Okay, yep. I think that's enough for like writing melodies. Now let's talk a little bit about interactive music and implementation into the game. A game is very different from a movie because in a movie you know exactly what happens. You
Yep.
know what happens 10 seconds later, so you can actually, like if it's a horror movie, you can do like a swell up to that point where something leaps onto the screen because you know it's going to happen. Um, Very different in a game because you don't know sometimes what the player is doing. So let's see what we have there as bullet points. Right. So um, there's of course different games also. I mean, if it's like an action game that has like an end of level boss, like the old game structures,
Yep.
it's pretty straightforward. You have like a driving music getting you through the level, and then at the end there's like a crescendo to a loop that is even more high intensity when you have to fight a boss or something like that.
Yep.
But there's also situations in games where you have an open world and you don't know, is the player actually waiting here for for a minute or something, or is he taking a right turn and going into that building that has a lot of monsters in
Yep.
them or something like that. So this is like when you look at the game and the design document, keep that in mind. What is this game? Is this like open world or is it more straightforward? And then think about what that means to the music. So let's go to the next point. Yeah, so first example here is the transition from that regular action game to like an end of level boss. That could be as simple as a crossfade or fade out of the level tune and then quick start of that boss track. That would be one thing. And then there's also important parts like stingers and jingles. Like for example, if you want to scare the player, you can have like a loud element
Yep.
roughly in the same key of the underlying piece. Or you have a jingle when, for example, you're going on to the next scenario level. So level complete. It's like a short piece that you finished it,
Yep.
and you also you have to think about we're going to play on that later with the implementation. So how are those things triggered in the game? In an open world scenario, oh yeah, here this was like keep the music piece in roughly the same key can help tremendously in making the sound more cohesive if you go from one scenario to the next.
Yeah.
There's also some other tricks where you can do like layers, where you compose the music in several layers of intensity, and you crossfade between them. Because you know when you stack them up in your
Yep.
audio sequencer, they play all in sync, and then you export one like low intensity part, and then a middle intensity and a high intensity. Then you have 3 files that can play perfectly in sync, and the game engine can then essentially like play the like a producer with virtual faders, where the higher intensity comes in and it's like a crossfade between layers, or it's additions
Yep.
where you play them all at
Yep.
the same time. Yeah, this is another important part. The delivery workflow. So when you prepare your files to the developer, you have to because it's often that you have revisions in the game.
Yep.
You start working on a melody, you send them a demo, and then you send them something that's more work in progress, and then eventually you come to like the finalizing, and it can get very tedious keeping track of what is the final version, what is approved, stuff like that. For that, I would suggest that you, if the developer allows it, work with something like Google Docs, where you can have spreadsheets that
Yep.
everybody can access at the same time, and you always know which is the last version because
Yep.
it takes care of you for that. So if you paste a comment in there or say like, hey, have a new delivery file, so then the developer can look that up in there and knows, okay, that is actually the current version of it. File
Yep.
naming convention is an important thing, and there's a lot of info out there on the internet. If you do a Google search about game audio, you'll find tons of information of how to do that kind of stuff. It's even more important for people who work with sound effects and voice lines, for example, because they sometimes have thousands of files to work with, and so there's plenty of information out there on how to
Yep.
develop a good method of naming files and keeping track of versions
Yep.
and final stuff. Yeah. And then another important part, with a film composer, you're often like just delivering a mix and say, okay, it starts here with a time code and that's it. But with games, it's a little bit more complicated because game audio needs to be triggered by the engine, and you have to have a good relationship with the person doing the implementation. Sometimes the composer can also do it themselves. There's also like tools for that now with audio middleware, it's called, or game engines that have audio stuff built in already, like Unreal Engine, for example. And if you as a composer can do that, you definitely have a leg up over the competition. So you can actually download a lot of those tools for free and play around with them and watch videos on YouTube, anywhere, to get an idea of what the implementation means. And even if you at the end don't do it, having an understanding how the developer then helps you input your tracks, then it's definitely helpful if you know about how that works. On the Star Wars game, for example, we had zones in the 3D level that you could define, and you had like an enter zone and an exit zone. And the reason for that was we were flying around in this big open world, and it would have been really tough if you would just like be on the line where a music piece fades over to another one. If you then just go back and forth, it would be like not very pleasant to the ear. So we actually had an enter zone which was smaller than the exit zone, and then you would define that if you fly into the enter zone, the music would change, but it wouldn't immediately change back. If you reverse course, you would have to then go over the threshold of the exit zone in order to fall back to the old music.
Okay.
Things like that. And then also the mix, since it's like mixing a game is also kind of an interactive thing. Sometimes it's like even really interactive, where when you come closer to a scene, music becomes louder or something like that. But also in general, like the levels between sound effects and music, that's something you have to navigate together with the developer. And that's a process until the very end, until the game ships.
Okay. So now we have tips and advice.
Yeah, that's kind of like a few things that that are more generic. If you have never done any game audio work, how do you get into the business is often a question I get asked. And I think the most important thing in general is that you're tenacious about it. I mean, this is not coming from today to tomorrow and then you have like some great projects. This is like a few years in the working, and so it helps if you have some other income during that time so you can work towards that goal. But yeah, I mean, I assume if somebody is really interested, that they probably have some talent, but it's really like sticking with it and just like keep working at it, chipping away and at that problem, getting the foot in the door. And this brings me to the next point there. Very important.
Yes, that's.
I personally have never seen a a project being picked up or a composer being picked up just by sending in their demo reels.
Yes.
Usually they have, of course, demos of their work on their website, stuff like that. But it's like the relationship you build with developers out there. If they know you and have heard maybe about your music somewhere, they might approach you. Hey,
Yes.
do you want to do this? And so I've gotten most of my gigs through old contacts or going to industry events and just hanging out with the people who are there doing the games. That kind of like having a meal with them, that like breaks the ice.
Yeah.
And then if you send a demo into them, then it's a totally different story.
If you know
but
them.
Just like sending out your demo to 100 companies. Nobody even at the developers has really time to go through all that stuff.
Yeah.
That's the other problem.
Yeah.
But they hear Jasper Kid that the Assassin's Creed series, and they want your game works with that kind of music. They want you as the composer, and that's basically how it works.
Yeah. I think that is in different parts of the gaming industries. I mean, it's also I get my projects right now because I have over the years made contacts. Okay, right now it's a bit hard to go to events, but usually everyone was asking, "Hey Sven, how can I get into the video game business?" They go to events, make contacts, show them your products, be nice, be kind, do at the beginning do work for not so much money. Sometimes maybe I did jobs when I started writing articles for free. People said, don't do this. It was good because after this, I was getting paid and get other contacts, other projects, and so it moves on.
Right. And even like one point that's not in here is there's actually schools for that kind of stuff now. They're usually very expensive, but that's how it is nowadays with education in general. But what they also do is they build relationships from like your classmates. So if you're and I'm not talking about just music, if you go to like maybe take a semester or a few courses of game development as a aspiring game composer, then you actually see what they're teaching about game development, and you might meet your classmates who are just starting out, and who knows, in a few years they might create a great game, and they hire you just because you went to the same class together.
Yeah, I mean, there are also right now, I think since a couple of years possible in Germany, I think in Darmstadt, that you get to a state university and make this courses, not only at the...
Exactly, so there is actually, particularly in Germany, there's a few that don't cost you a lot to do. And even some institutions allow you to sit in on a few classes or something. You don't even need to sign up for like a full course. So
but I think I can't say it enough. Contacts.
That's really the most important thing. And then build your brand. This is something I actually neglected, particularly because I was employed at Factor 5 the first 10 years in the US. I did not build my brand up a lot during that time. And this was exactly the time when the internet came up. And so I'm ever since playing catch up with my social media stuff. So social media can be a problem in this world, but it can also be a great tool because you can actually get fans that way. And so you can showcase your music on a lot of platforms, definitely YouTube is a huge platform. If you can do some video work and present your music there, I mean, if you've just seen that one example of the Patreon track that I did a fun music video for, that gets you actually listeners and people paying attention. And like SoundCloud and all these platforms, they're all important to showcase your music and building your brand and getting fans. And also like know your limits. I'll never be John Williams, but I definitely can do something like Hans Zimmer is doing in terms of the compositions. I can aspire to that, or what a lot of the electronic bands that I idolized and inspired to can do. And I can do that, and I can innovate on that front too. So don't get discouraged if you don't get your music to the level of a certain composer that you admire. Go with the best of what you can do and then improve on that.
Yeah.
And of course, never stop learning or experimenting. And then, another thing is like you can totally be swept up in your music aspirations, be it hobby or business or whatever. But you need other things to get your creative juices going. So like find some interesting hobbies or travel or make friends and social contacts. That's like things that can break you out of your if you're having a burnout effect or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, like Yoda's mother. Do or do not, there's no try.
Yeah.
That's kind of like what I had to do when I did the Star Wars music. I was so intimidated, and I just did it. And of course I had doubts, and I was not just physically but also emotionally aching by the time we shipped the game. But then years later I looked back and I listened to it, and I was surprised that I actually did a very, very decent job, I mean, so just do it, don't question it.
That is something. I mean, as I am a freelancer and people come to me and ask, hey Sven, can you do this? I said the first thing I said is yes, for sure. And then when the call is over, I said, I Google, okay, what did he say? Okay, that I have to do. Yeah, I do it. And it worked out right until now. So
exactly. So then next good point is if you encounter this writer's block, composer writer's block, and we all experienced that at one point. There is a thing called oblique strategies. Brian Eno developed that in the 70s. He's like a electronic pioneer. And in order to break through this writer's block, he came up with like a deck of cards, which you can shuffle, and then you draw a card, and each card has like a message on there.
Yeah.
And the message might be as simple as, play it backwards. Like take your MIDI sequence of your melody and turn it around and see what happens then, things like that, or take a walk.
Yeah.
There's simple things on those cards, and you draw 3 of those cards, and actually online you can draw them on a web server now. And then you apply that to your current writer's block, and you'll be surprised how quickly you break through that writer's block.
Okay, cool. That's I will Google that.
Yep. That works for other creative things too, not just for composing music. Okay, again, record everything. This is actually when, in the old days, when I didn't have a MIDI sequence, I actually had a tape deck running constantly. Yeah. So I actually have like probably, I don't know, countless hours of just jamming on the keyboard with different sounds. And I just recorded that onto these tapes. And of course, I kept them, and I digitized them at some point, and I still have them somewhere. And if you would listen through that, every now and then you come across like a melody that I then used in a Turrican game or something, you know, later, because you need to remember what you did when you're jamming.
Awesome.
Yeah, here again, use Google and YouTube for any questions about game audio. If you want to learn about the topic, you'll find it.
Yeah.
It's really fantastic time we live in. And then, yeah, finally, this is actually the final point. Always make backups of your data.
Yeah.
It's like I learned that the hard way in the early days of the C64, even, you know, when
Everyone learned that the hard way. I know, don't know anyone would ever say, I did it from the beginning. I did it from the beginning. No.
if you ever have like spent 2 hours on your source code and then the computer crashes and you realize, uh-oh, I didn't save it. It's really the worst thing because first of all, it's just tedious work.
Yeah.
And second, you're always like worried, can I recreate this? You know. So what I do actually nowadays is I work all my work folders are in the Dropbox. I pay $10 a month. I have a terabyte of space on the Dropbox, and I assign a folder on my hard drive. But immediately when I save a Cubase project, it's being uploaded in the cloud in the background, and I have a copy there. And even if my computer burns up, it's still in the cloud. I just need to remember my password, and there it is. Same with like backups that you do of like larger data that you put on hard drives. You know, I usually do it on 2 drives, and one of them I put into like a storage outside of our home.
Yeah.
Because you never know what happens.
Yeah.
And most of the current stuff is in the Dropbox. So that's a very, very important point. So a few more minutes left.
We have.
Are there more questions? You had a few questions that you.
I had a few questions, but also the audience has a few questions. So
cool.
So I mean, the most questions I had are in your presentations, but I would maybe going to the actual pandemic situation, because you are also a freelancer. I mean, you work from home. You have a rolling home because, as you said, travel.
Right.
You
so
travel a lot.
One fun thing there is like 5 years ago, we were unhappy where we were living, my wife and I, in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I was freelance, and we needed like a break from this because it's so expensive to live there, and we were all just like living for the mortgage, and so it became too tedious. And then I discovered like there's people out there who just full-time travel around in a motorhome, and that fascinated me. And so we talked about it and we looked more into it, and all of a sudden this was like also for my creativity an interesting point. What I mentioned, do some traveling if you can. We took it to the next level and we made my studio completely mobile. So we sold most of our stuff, got rid of the house, and put the rest in storage, and bought a motorhome that was like a bus, like a big bus. And built my studio in there and got on the road. And this was 4.5 years ago. And now we're actually at the point where we traveled so much that we wanted to find a place to call home again. So we actually, last year we bought some land and we want to build a house again. And I'm dreaming, of course, of another studio build. But the travel also enabled us to find that right place. And so, yeah, that was a big step for us, and it's been really fun.
Yeah, as you said, make contacts.
Yeah,
and that worked also. So, we have some.
But you asked about the pandemic. If
the
that
pandemic,
affected
yeah.
my work. Sure, it has a little bit, but game development luckily didn't stop because a lot of programmers could just work from home, and so in that sense, not much has changed, but I definitely can feel a little bit like that people buy maybe a little bit less online music and things like that because they're
Okay.
financially hurting a little bit. But overall, we're doing okay in the scheme of things. And we actually have some really exciting projects that we're working on.
Yeah.
And we're looking forward to looking past the pandemic with positive views.
Yeah. We also. So, questions we have from Nina. If somebody would make a remake of Turrican, would you recreate your tracks like Streets of Rage 4? Or would you like stay it like it was?
On the Turrican Soundtrack anthology, I stayed close to the original compositions,
Mhm.
but I updated all the sounds to like studio standard, and then I added some elements like in the middle of the
Yeah.
arrangement just to give
Mhm.
the listener. But you can actually in part play the original Amiga tracks and the new ones almost in sync, and you can fade back and forth. I actually did that while I was developing it. So yeah, but I'm also thinking about possibly doing another remix album that takes it into a totally different style, just for fun. So yeah, it's different from time to time.
Mhm. Okay. Jay wants to know: do you have an soundtracks you admire from newer games?
Soundtracks from other
Yes,
composers.
other composers. Yes.
Oh wow, I mentioned Yuzo Koshiro
Yeah.
earlier. Like he did amazing stuff on the Sega Mega Drive and then the Super Nintendo. And the one that really blew
Mm.
me away was ActRaiser.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
which had this kind of like to me at the time it sounded like a Hollywood soundtrack with orchestra coming out of the Super Nintendo, and so that was really cool. I mentioned Jasper Kid,
Yeah. Just Kid.
really a big fan how he combines electronic elements uh, with orchestral stuff. Um, and then yeah, there's a ton more, definitely. Very cool stuff.
Yeah. And she had a second question. What do you think of soundtracks created in new/old formats, like in Micromages?
Not exactly sure what she means.
Yeah.
Maybe like if you create soundtracks with old tools on the old systems, like making it sound like a Nintendo
Mm.
Entertainment System or something like that. That could be very, very cool. Usually those modern games then have like two versions where you can switch over between the different
Yeah.
styles.
Okay. That is a question maybe you couldn't answer or don't want to answer right now. Or you can tell it me to me personally after the stream. Are you expecting that at some point limited run games will make a new part of Turrican? I mean, or another, maybe say another publisher, because I don't think limited run games do some mostly new games.
It,
Strictly Limited made, I think, only a new import to the old game, but a new part. So, yeah.
it paves the way, I think. I think for years, if not decades, we were hoping for a new Turrican game.
Yep.
And there had been actually a few attempts
Yeah.
during the Factor 5 time here in the US. We had Tornado, which was a Turrican-like game, and then we had actually a third-person Turrican game,
Yeah.
which had some very cool elements, but unfortunately those needed to be shelved at the time.
Yeah.
I still hope for another episode, and I certainly hope that it might be a 2D gameplay with modern elements, because that's really what made Turrican so cool
Yeah.
back then.
Yeah.
But now we have more than ever a chance to make that happen in the future because of that strictly limited deal. So
Okay.
we're working towards it.
Yeah.
Keep fingers crossed, thumbs pressed, all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Knock on wood.
Okay. So, wow, that was a perfect
Time is
land.
pretty much up.
Yeah, time is pretty much up. It was really a perfect landing. And so, Chris, I want to say thank you very much for this
Thank
interview.
you, and thanks to the B3 Biennial event to feature this and sponsor us. And I hope with the with this you guys could learn something and look into game audio in the future.
Yeah. So thanks again very much. And I think when I jump over to the okay, that was okay. He sent me some questions, and okay.
If
So
you want a final piece to play us out of this, I would suggest something from the latest orchestral album there on Bandcamp, the
Bandcamp, yeah,
orchestral selections.
orchestral selections.
It's there on the left top. Go up on the down a little bit in the third row on the left. Yeah, that's no, not that one.
That one, yeah. Okay.
And listen to Techno Dungeon, which is a very interesting arrangement, which we changed up from the game, which was more straightforward. But here it sounds almost like in the beginning, Turrican almost lost the battle, is totally beaten down, but he gets up and gets on his feet again and collects himself, and then in the end he is kind of like into a victorious mode, and he is not giving up, that kind of thing. It's a very cool piece.
Yeah. So I will play it a bit, and then
just
I will stop the stream. So you can just it's chrishülsbeck.bandcamp.com, or just Google Chris Hülsbeck and Bandcamp, and then you find it. So it's very, very easy. And I
play that, and thank you, Sven.
Yeah, and thank you, Chris. So I just play it, and
until next time.
Bye.